open up this critical space. With that being said, throughout this webinar, we'll be talking about a lot of critical issues that affect students in the realm of education. So if we think about ethnicity and race and how that intersects with disability and linguistic background, this webinar, along with the conversations we will be having, are meant to prompt critical thinking and growth alongside with that. We would encourage you all to just come in with this with a very open mind and to foster a community of growth. We're going to highlight here, there may be moments where you feel uncomfortable, and that is a good sign of growth, right? And just hold space for that and acknowledge that. But also we encourage you to acknowledge, not only just acknowledge, but to explore that discomfort deeply within this webinar, but then even outside of this webinar itself. So we're just really here as a community space. Yeah.
Yay, cool. Very well said. So as you can see on the agenda, our next step is to talk about some of our objectives.
Yeah, and so a few of our objectives here, the first one and foremost is really understanding intersectionality and its importance in the development and improvement of inclusive post-secondary education programs. Really recognizing that many of the students we interact with, they don't just hold one identity, but rather many multifaceted identities that we need to be taken into consideration as we're implementing teaching practices and a curriculum and assessment. Secondly, we hope that you can take away some points regarding understanding race and ethnicity and disability and how those really intertwine. We're going to reiterate throughout the night, but really these don't operate independently or within a separate vacuum, right? They intertwine with each other simultaneously to create unique experiences of oppression within realms of education.
Yeah, no, really well said. Our final two objectives on this PowerPoint or on the slide are that we're going to work to resist essentialist perspectives about disability and race, mainly the idea that there are these unchangeable aspects of who people are based on aspects of their identity, and explore how that contributes to deficit mindsets regarding students with marginalized identities. And then in a really broad sense, we're going to learn more and understand about how to apply inclusive approaches to teaching and learning practices as educators in whatever sense, way, shape, or form that we work in educational settings. So yeah. Any questions so far, folks? I feel like we're already getting into the thick of it. But we just wanted to take this chance to introduce ourselves also. Maria, I'll let you start.
Sure. And so this is just really a big introduction into not only all of you getting to know us as researchers and the lenses and backgrounds we hold, but also to help prompt a critical idea or conversation about how your identity plays a role in the work that you do. And so with that, I'm going to start with my positionality. Again, my name is Maria. You can also call me Maria as well. I'm a former ROAR graduate assistant. I worked with ROAR for 2.5 years, and I also taught their digital literacy course. Currently, I am a leadership coordinator with the Office of Multicultural Student Services, where I oversee the Compass Mentor Program. I am a Chicana. For folks who are not familiar with that term, I am Mexican American. So I was born here in the United States, but I am the daughter of immigrants from Mexico. I'm also a current doctoral student in the Cultural Studies and Social Thought and Education program. And lastly, I do identify as bilingual. English is my primary language. It was the first language that I learned, and Spanish is my secondary. I want to reiterate too, especially as we're talking about power dynamics and resisting essentialist views, bilingualism is fluid and it's on a spectrum. And so I want to highlight that, especially as I speak about my Spanish background.
Yeah, well said. Thanks, Maria. My name's Bailey again. I'm currently a ROAR graduate assistant. I'm the instructor for our career planning and professional development course. So I work with students on a variety of topics on learning career skills, pathways, opportunities, and the tools and skills needed to explore and advocate for ourselves in the world of employment. But I'm also a student. I've been working for ROAR for about 3 years. I began my work with ROAR as an undergraduate while I was working towards my bachelor's degree in English education. And then I'm currently working towards my master's of arts in special education. I also identify as an advocate in many senses, but mainly an advocate for the students that I work with regarding their schoolwork, employment opportunities, and their interpersonal relationships. I identify as queer, but also as an ally for the identities or people who have identities within the queer community that I don't identify with. I recognize there's privilege and layers of privilege as being a queer person, and I'm also white, so lots of privilege there. And so as I engage my own community, I recognize that I don't understand every single lived experience within that. I'm also an English speaker. I've only ever spoken English. That is the only language I know. But I'm also a very relationally oriented person. And so one of my driving forces in how I teach, when I teach, and where I teach is who I'm working with, why I'm working with them. And then my biggest support system are the relationships in my life. And so without those things, I wouldn't be the educator or person I am. So yeah.
So hopefully you got a little bit of a taste of what it looks like to identify or to talk about what positionality looks like, what your different identities are, and how that intertwines, right, to either create power dynamics or not. And so as Bailey mentioned, I want to reiterate too, while I did work for WSU ROAR, I'm also someone who isn't someone with a learning disability or an intellectual disability. So I want to recognize that while yes, I did work with people with disabilities, it doesn't necessarily mean that I know or can fully understand those experiences of people with disabilities. And so I think that's really important to highlight as we think about our own positionalities, especially as educators. We do have those lenses from our own very unique perspectives, and they're not the same as some of the students we work with. And sometimes those lenses can kind of create a blurry vision for exactly the kinds of ways that education or curricula can enforce, or teaching practice can enforce oppressive systems. So with that being said, we want to do a little bit of an activity here, and Bailey can set up the breakout rooms if possible. But we're going to do some really quick breakout rooms here, and let you all explore your own positionality as educators, as researchers, or what have you. This hopefully will start this conversation. You don't have to have this all figured out. It could just be bullet points of your different parts of your identity. But we encourage you to start listing those out, and we'll give you time to brainstorm that. And then within your group, you're going to kind of talk about your own positionality and to begin to think about how some aspects of your own identity, may enforce power dynamics or may not. And so I think, Bailey, why don't we do like a 2 to 3 minute just brainstorm on your own? And then
Yeah.
after that, like a 5-minute breakout session.
Yeah, does anyone have questions about that? It can sound big and scary, but you all know yourselves best. And so what feels like important information to share with us, or just be aware as we move through this presentation. So we'll do like 2 minutes, kind of write your own, identify some specific and important aspects of your own identity, and then we'll do about 5 minutes of sharing in a group. You won't have to share in front of the big group. I know that's scary. Okay, cool. So in my head, I'll count to 2 minutes, and then we will go into breakout rooms. So about 30 more seconds of writing to yourself. All right, cool. I'm gonna assign us breakout rooms. I know some people communicated that they're not able to talk right now, and if that's the case, that's totally okay. If you feel comfortable, you could just pop your own positionality statement or just some key points about your own positionality and identity in the chat for your group, but no pressure. All right, I'm gonna prompt you with those breakout rooms. Okay, cool. Did you all get your invitations? We're gonna test my technology skills tonight. Cool. Well, it looks like everyone is back now. Thank you all for doing that. I really appreciate it. I know it's no one's favorite thing to ever jump into breakout rooms and talk to strangers, but I hope that made you feel like your identity has a space in this and other people's do as well. And just recognizing that we all have very different identities and the positions we hold within our lives are just so varied, and we all can come to spaces like this and recognize that we have a lot of room to continue growing. And then one thing I just kind of want to hit on before we move on from this little activity, or before I give you the chance to share any findings, that it's just impossible for us to know everything about other people. There's just no reality in which that can happen or should happen. The capacity we have as individuals isn't to know every detail or aspect of someone else's identity, but it is to become really well acquainted with ours so that we can better understand the impacts our own identity may have on other people and just the gaps in what we can learn and know and collaborate with others on. With that being said, did anyone want to share anything from their breakout rooms and really having a riveting conversation about positionality?
Yeah, I've done this many times, and it was really neat. I hopped in late on the conversation with Emma and Elizabeth, and Maria joined us. But the notion that we talked about how your positionality can change. It's not, it's dynamic, and it can also shift. Like, you don't have to have the bulleted list that you read off to everybody. It shifts around the context that you're in and what's most salient, right, within those contexts. And so I really appreciated Elizabeth and Emma's thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you sharing. I think Emma has been someone who's taught me a lot about the importance of positionality, so I'm happy she's here and I'm happy you had the chance to chat with her. Sean, would you like to share as well?
Yeah, kind of just speaking to what you had just kind of brought about, like it's really impossible to get to know someone as well as you would want to. And like I was in a room with Marcus, and it was just really the two of us for the majority of the time, and we talked the entire time, and we didn't even, I think, really scratch the surface on like getting to know one another, just because there's so many things and people are so complex, and so it's important, to take time to try to get to know people as well as possible, but I just think it was kind of a fun way to get to know people, but also remind ourselves about that truth.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think there's so much power in rooting ourselves as humans who don't know much, and we just continue to try to know more. Yeah, anyone else want to share? I don't want to cut anyone off, but I don't want to keep you here till 6, so we can move forward if we'd like. Cool. As we go through this little presentation, we're going to be using some terminology that I'm very familiar with, Maria's very familiar with, most people in ROAR or the College of Education may be familiar with, but we just wanted to make sure we're all starting with the same knowledge about these fancy words we're going to be throwing around. And so, Maria, if you want to start by just giving some brief background on the term DisCrit.
Absolutely. So DisCrit is a theoretical framework. And basically, in really simple terms, it was born out of disability studies or critical disability studies and critical race theory. So scholars recognize that within critical disability studies, there was a need to take a look at the intersections of race and ethnic background. And so that's when they decided to add critical race theory to disability studies and create this amazing framework, DisCrit. We will be referencing this framework quite a bit throughout our presentation.
Yeah, so CRP is an abbreviation or an acronym for culturally responsive pedagogy. I was first introduced to this term as culturally responsive teaching, but for the sake of clarity, and so that we don't get confused with CRT as critical race theory, we're going to be calling this critically or culturally responsive pedagogy. And this is another framework a lot of our work was rooted in, and so I will talk your ear off about this in about 20 minutes, so buckle up. But yes, it's a very, very, very detailed framework to view teaching and learning through.
Bailey, can I just interrupt for a second? I
Yeah.
just realized that there might be a couple folks here who aren't familiar with ROAR, and that's becoming a common, just reference point. So can you just
Yes.
give a brief description for us?
Yeah, so we'll get into this a bit more in like 2 slides, but ROAR is an inclusive post-secondary education program where we work with young adults with intellectual or developmental disabilities. And the goal is to provide a college experience and support students as they explore new stages of education in the university setting. We have some detailed history. I don't want to blow past that slide with my rambling now, but there's some context for it for those of you who do not know. Yeah.
And with that, I think it segues really nicely into our next term. You've probably already seen me use this or Bailey mention it, but that is IFSE. That's just an acronym. As in education, there's many acronyms. That's Inclusive Post-Secondary Education Program. So when you see that, that's what we're referring to. So ROAR is an inclusive post-secondary program, and there's many programs like ROAR who serve people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and those are called IFSE programs.
Yeah, perfect, great. And then SWD is another acronym, which just is an abbreviation for students with disabilities. We're going to use people first language throughout this presentation, and highly very much suggest that you do too in your daily practice within educational settings. The people we work with are students first, and then they have disabilities. So yeah.
Throughout this presentation, you're also going to see this disability represented with dis/ability. This is a term used more recently to really counter the emphasis on having a whole person be represented by what they cannot do. That's the dis part, and it rather puts an emphasis or highlights the parts that people with disabilities can do.
Yep, perfect. And then IDD is our last term that we wanted to clarify. This is an abbreviation for intellectual and or developmental disabilities. That is the population of students that makes up ROAR. And so that's what most of our knowledge and information is rooted in. So yeah, any questions about these? Okay, and then if you have any questions about fancy words or just random words that we may throw out in this presentation, feel free to stop us and ask us. Eric, I appreciate you doing that. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to talk briefly about the history in the United States regarding people with disabilities. So that's policy and the legal parts of it, as well as the legal parts of experiences for people of color. And multilingual students and people as well. I really want to highlight these next 2 slides, as this is not an exhaustive list of what exactly the history looks like. These are just some really hard-hitting points, some important points to lay the groundwork for why we do what we do in this research and in this space. So please take that and note that. But really, just really highlighting and throughout history in the United States, exclusionary schools have been really the foundation of education for students with disabilities. There have been separate schools for people with disabilities, and this had been a practice for about, I think, over just about 150 years. It's important to note that this level of discrimination throughout this time, students with disabilities, many of them also didn't receive an education. And so if we're thinking about privilege and power, right, we're really thinking about those 150 years where they couldn't even access education versus people who were. So just really setting them back in that way. There's also been a really strong history, especially in the United States, of institutionalization of people with disabilities. And a lot of that just really came from the idea of needing to fix people with disabilities, which is a very harmful mindset, but then also really thinking about the mindset of deficit views of people with disabilities. And that's really what a lot of these previous laws and policies have been enwrapped with that sort of mindset. And so eventually in history, students with disabilities were able to go to school and policy changed. However, as maybe some people have noticed, or not, that schools, kind of operated in this separate kind of framework. So they would really have a traditional students be doing school in a traditional sense, and then separate people with disabilities in a separate wing or doing separate programs, etc. And so while in theory that may seem inclusive, it really wasn't, because it wasn't really true inclusivity of being involved in the community and connecting with students and being a part of traditional education. And so I know we talk a lot about, in terms of disability and also people of color, in terms of the educational, realm, but it's also really important to note that there is also society pressures and societal norms that have been enforced to enforce policy like this, or to enforce curriculum and teaching that supports these kinds of deficit mindsets. And so, within society, there have been many laws and regulations and policy and rhetoric, talking about, people with disabilities in a deficit mindset, or people of color in a deficit way. And so that's really important to know, and that comes in many forms, right? It could be media, it could be, other things. So just really being cognizant of that. I know we also mentioned history, but these are things that are also very prevalent in our society today. They may not be as overt as they were years ago, but they're very much still in place here in today's society. So I just also want to highlight the exclusionary and oppressive education that has not only exists based on disability status, but is also is a long-standing aspect of like racial segregation in schooling. And Bailey will kind of touch a little bit on this in her slides, but really targeting BIPOC populations, like Indigenous people who are enrobed in the BIPOC population, but also multilingual students. And so we're thinking about separate but equal is really a big, what was supposed to be inclusive or aimed towards a level of inclusivity, but really wasn't. And so those kinds of policies for Indigenous folks, thinking about the utilization of boarding schools, which forced assimilation of Indigenous folks and for them to leave their Indigenous backgrounds behind, along with all of the violence associated with boarding schools. And then lastly, I'll really touch on multilingual students as well, and just the multilingual population in the United States has been affected by English-only laws in many states. And just throughout history, but even more in contemporary context as well. And so it's really important to note that. And again, as I mentioned, with people with disabilities, while there may be in some states no overt policy or legal regulations oppressing these populations, there certainly are societal norms and rhetoric that are still floating around within society that view these populations in a deficit way and prevent these populations from accessing resources and privileges.
Yeah, no, thank you for covering all of that, Maria. I really appreciate it. That was really well said. And then just to provide some like legal contextualization for the systematic barriers that have consistently been in place for students with marginalized identities, I wanted to highlight these three specific legal precedences. And this is in no way, shape, or form an exhaustive list. It's a very, very brief and general overview. And then for those of you who have worked in educational settings, like these cases and legal policies aren't new to you, but I wanted to provide reference for the historical importance of exclusionary education policies. And that would be Brown v. Board of Education, which works to desegregate schools. The Indian Education Act, which was the first legal step taken to stop boarding school practices from happening. And then the originally named Education for All Handicapped Children Act in 1975, which was renamed in 2004, or 1992 Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, common term for that is IDEA, and that was reauthorized in 2004 to be an act for improvement. And so education as we know it today is the product of policies such as these, and these policies have excluded students based on aspects of their identities, such as like race, disability, indigeneity, their immigration status, and language. This being the foundation of education in America means that we can't participate and work in conversations like this without recognizing the systematic barriers that are in place for students with marginalized identities. And again, this is a list on a PowerPoint. And even being an educator myself, I know that I have so much room to grow and learn and understanding how these policies continue to affect students that we work with. So now, the long-awaited history of ROAR. To give you some more context, Maria can take you away on this.
Absolutely. So just a little bit of demographic context. Before we talk about ROAR, we want to just talk about IPSI programs in general, their history, and what that kind of looks like. And so the first IPSI program was created in 1987. And so that while that may seem like many years ago, in retrospect, thinking about education and how long education has been prevalent in the United States, that's really not that long ago. And so just important to note that. Today, there are 300 plus IPSI programs around the United States. And it's important to also note that these IPSI programs vary in program offerings. So some do some residential or inclusive residential opportunities. So students who are living on campus. Some are more commuter based. Among some other parts as well. Some of them are also not based at four-year universities. Some of them are at community colleges. And so just really highlighting the diversity in that sense of the many IPSI programs that are around the United States. And so with that, it's important to know that these are new programs, right? As we're thinking about educational context. And so I just wanted to highlight while there is diversity within IPSI programs, there's also room for improvement. And so they can, right, many IPSI programs can work on diversity outside of disabilities. So that means looking at linguistic background, looking at race and ethnic background, and providing, that inclusive space. And I really want to highlight recruiting students of color and students with different linguistic backgrounds is absolutely important, right? However, it's not just about recruiting, right, and just inclusion. Rather, it's also thinking about ways to retain students and just thinking about what are ways that we can support these students while also thinking about the other intersectional identities within education and some hardships they may face or barriers as multilingual students or students of color within higher education systems, and especially as people with disabilities as well. So just a really brief history of ROAR. ROAR is located on the WSU Pullman campus. It is a rural town. For context, in 2018, that was when WSU ROAR was founded and it started off with just 5 students. In 2020, ROAR received a $2.5 million grant, the TIPSID grant, and that really supported just kind of getting ROAR off the ground and really supporting recruiting and getting this program to what it is today with the amount of students that we have today and support as well. And so today, in the 23-24 academic school year, there are 22 ROAR students within the program.
Yeah, great. We love growth in the program. That's awesome. So when Maria and I first talked about this idea for our project, we really wanted to focus on the idea of centering student voice, not only in the objectives of the presentation, but even in the resources that we engaged with. And so we participated in interviews with 3 different ROAR students. We talked about 11 different questions, and these interviews lasted around 30 minutes. The questions that we engaged students with were focused on how each student made sense of their identity within educational systems. And so throughout this presentation, we're going to touch back on some specific quotes that guided our work and our research about diverse post-secondary education programs. But just to start us off, some of the common themes that we found from each of these interviews were community, safety, and opportunity. From the 3 interviews with students, these seem to be some of the things that were either most impactful, most important to them to feel included, or something that made them feel seen culturally. And so I pulled out some of these 4 quotes that don't necessarily justify these themes, but are representative of the student's identity within these conversations. And so Kevin is a second-year student in the ROAR program, And when talking about the importance of community, he says, it is all about bringing people together, sharing the love and respect we have for every community you are in. So Kevin was recognizing that students within the ROAR program or students outside of the ROAR program are involved in multiple communities, and that impacts who they are within these educational settings. In the bottom right corner, Des, a first-year ROAR student, we prompted and asked like what if there have been things within his education that have made him feel empowered. And he said that in educational settings, people seeing him as a Native person is really impactful. Acknowledging that aspect of his identity is important. And in the bottom left, Mia was speaking. She's a first-year student in ROAR. She was speaking about the importance of speaking Japanese within education and being a person with disability. And she says, it doesn't put me under the bus, it puts me up on the bus. It really shares who I am as a Down syndrome kid with Down syndrome and being half American and Japanese. So these are just some quotes to get us started thinking about the perspectives that students shared with us. And I want to inform you all that each student consented to participating in these interviews and having their information shared during this process. We allowed them the opportunity to choose pseudonyms, but every single student was pretty committed to having their names attached to the words they were speaking because it was very, very closely connected to their identity. They also all were invited to this presentation tonight along with other ROAR students, but asking them to be here on a Wednesday night for a webinar wasn't their jam. And so totally appreciate that. We're also going to be sharing this recording with them. Yeah. So next we're just jumping into our theoretical frameworks to give you all some background info on just these ideas that guided our work. I'll let Maria kick us off with DisCrit.
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, DisCrit is really our grounding theoretical framework here, and it really shaped, how would we structure these interviews? How do we talk about these things with our students? It really centers around thinking about curriculum assessment and teaching practices. There are core tenets in DisCrit we'll talk about in the next slide. And while you'll notice some of them are bold, all of those tenets are equally as important in doing this kind of work. However, there are some that we really highlight in the work that we're doing. And yeah, I think Bailey can take culturally responsive pedagogy.
Yeah, so culturally responsive pedagogy is fairly complex and very in-depth, but what aspects of it that we're going to focus on are the focus on identity and development, cognitive engagement, relational learning, and empowering instruction. We'll focus on this during the teaching practices section, but this is a really formative framework in the way I've made sense of education, especially within IPSI programs. So I'm excited to share it with you all.
And then lastly, a really good framework to keep in mind is intersectionality. DisCrit does talk about this, but we felt that it was equally as important to recognize the work of Kimberly Crenshaw, who thought and came up with this theoretical framework of intersectionality. And so we just really want to highlight and again reiterate the importance of really recognizing the multifaceted identities that students hold and how that really is complex in the way that it works with education, in the way that their experiences are represented. And so, yeah.
Oh, awesome.
Okay, so here is the tenants page. The ones that are bolded again are the ones that we mostly focused on. Again, the first one really looking, DisCrit really looks at how forces of race and ableism circulate interdependently to uphold the notion of normalcy. And so again, this is really looking into that critical work. It's not always going to be overt. It's going to be things that are very hidden, or as I like to say, very coded. And so that might be language that's being used within curriculum. It might be language within policy. It might be even language within classroom management styles, etc. And so I think, again, thinking about that criticality piece, it's really important to recognize not just, how race is represented or misrepresented in these spaces, but also how ableism is perpetuated in a lot of educational spaces. DisCrit values multidimensional identities, and it challenges singular notions of identity such as race or disability. And so again, this is really highlighting that intersectionality piece. You know, I think some folks in the past have thought of, again, of these things as independent occurrences or independent things. Rather, we need to really be thinking about, right, again, the intersections of both race, disability, and linguistic background. The third tenet here emphasizes social constructions of race and ability, and yet recognizes material and psychological impacts. And so what we mean by social constructions is really delving into that idea that deficit values or deficit views on race or ability are really just things within that were created within society, right? So for a long time, there was scientific racism or science to justify why racism was okay, or ableism was okay. But really what DisCrit aims to acknowledge here, and a lot of other theoretical framework, is that this is very much a socially constructed idea, one that society came to a conclusion on to exclude certain groups of people from accessing certain privileges or rights. DisCrit, the fourth tenet, we're looking at privileges, the voices of marginalized populations, which are traditionally not acknowledged within research. I think this is really important to think about, especially doing work with people with disabilities, and how education, as I mentioned previously, has been an exclusionary space for people with disabilities. And so the big reason why we did these interviews was to really begin that work with the students. And I want to highlight that we're doing the work with the students, not on the students, right? And so we're building this research kind of community with them, including them in making decisions about what kind of questions we ask, what the format looks like. That way it's accessible. And then, you know, that's just really highlighting that advocacy part, right? And so that's something we really want to highlight, as well as the importance of that in education as well. So if you're thinking about implementing teaching practices or assessing curricula, as we mentioned in the earlier slides, positionality, if for example, myself, right, who is not neurodivergent, there are things that I'm not going to be able to pick up on or fully understand, but someone with a disability might. And so providing that space for students to advocate and be in that process of creating curriculum or adopting curricula or, you know, teaching practices, again, it's really, really highlighting the importance of advocacy in research, but also in educational spaces. The next tenet, recognizing legal and historical aspects of disability and race, and how both have been used separately and together to deny the rights of some citizens. So as we mentioned today, earlier in our slides, we talked about some historical context. I think it's so important, and as educators, we think about this a lot. Things happen within a context, and we need to be thinking about what those contexts are, not just in the current, but in the previous, but also thinking about what the future will look like, right? And so really understanding how historically these populations have been impacted in negative ways will really just give us a better understanding, and has given our work a better understanding of what we can do to move forward alongside with the populations that we work with. The last two we don't touch, we don't use or touch on as much within our slides, but I want to give them space and acknowledge them. So the last tenet recognizes whiteness and ability as property, and that gains for people labeled with disabilities, have been largely made as a result of interest convergence, white middle class citizens. And so I won't go into this too much, but I will just define whiteness as property and ability as property is really just thinking about how a person who is white, for example, a person who is able-bodied has access to certain rights that other people who don't embody those kinds of characteristics or identities do not have. And so those rights are certain, not necessarily always tangible, but there are certain access to different things, such as education and such as different power dynamics. I think it's really important to acknowledge that. Interest convergence is one that I will talk a little bit about for context if you are all curious. And just really thinking about how, right, in history, things have progressed, such as Brown versus Board of Education, but really looking at what were the intentions behind that, right? So the dominant group may have wanted Brown versus Board of Education to pass first for their own interests rather than the interest of marginalized groups, right? And so it's a really interesting period of time where two interests of both groups converge and then things get done. But the intentions behind why those policies or progressions get done are much different. And then the last one I think is important to think about, thinking about activism and advocacy. It requires activism and supports all forms of resistance. And so I'm sure many of us have seen pictures of protesting before, and generally you see large crowds of people, maybe in a street, they're holding signs, they're walking down, a street, and it's very, very busy. And for thinking about people with disabilities, that might not always be accessible. If we're thinking about people in wheelchairs, right? Going down a very crowded space might not be accessible. There may be hills, there may be cracks, etc. But also just recognizing that maybe it's an overstimulating environment. And so even though protesting and progressive thoughts and ideas have good intentions, sometimes they have left demographics out, right? And we're also thinking about multilingual students, right? A lot of these protests have also been English, dominant protests, right? Providing space for people with disabilities or multilingual background to also take part in forms of resistance that aren't just what we typically see. And then intersectionality here. I won't go into too much detail here because I'm being cognizant of time here, but really it's just recognizing how power dynamics manifest in classrooms, and how these also manifest within IPSI programs is really, really important, as we had touched on repeatedly, is the importance of positionality and really understanding those power dynamics, right? Where do your privileges sit and where do they not sit, and how are they incorporated within education and other contexts? And so with intersectionality in mind, teaching approaches, classroom management, discipline, adoption, and use of curricula should be vetted for an inclusive space, right? And so it's not just thinking that curricula or teaching practices should be a one-size-fits-all, but rather we're really thinking about what are the backgrounds of these students? What is their context, right? How can we best support these students so that they can be successful? And so with that, I won't go through the other bullet points, but I do want to show the video that I have linked here. I think it really provides context for what this looks like in education. So Bailey, do you mind clicking on the?
Yes, I'm so happy to. I'm just being aware of time. We may not have time to watch the whole
Okay.
video.
And
Well,
when you might have to unshare and then reshare and put share sound, when it pops up when you.
Totally, yes. I love technology. Okay. Sorry, everyone.
In the bottom left-hand corner when you pick your
Yes.
screen. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. It wants my password and everything. Sorry, everyone. Okay.
Pre-pandemic, I think folks might be getting a little antsy, but we're all familiar with the wait time for these things, so don't sweat it.
Password, I guess. Okay. Cool. Can we all see this video? Okay, cool.
Intersectionality is just a metaphor for understanding the ways that multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes compound themselves, and they create obstacles that often are not understood within conventional ways of thinking about anti-racism or feminism or whatever social justice advocacy structures we have. Intersectionality isn't so much a grand theory, it's a prism for understanding certain kinds of problems. African American girls are 6 times more likely to be suspended than white girls. That's probably a race and a gender problem. It's not just a race problem, it's not just a gender problem. So I encourage people to think about how the convergence of race stereotypes or gender stereotypes might actually play out in the classroom, between teachers and students, between students and other students, between students teachers and administrators and commit themselves to understanding that as a way of intervening and providing equal educational opportunity for all students, regardless of their identities. Identity isn't simply a self-contained unit. It is a relationship between people in history, people in communities, people in institutions. So schools do a good job when they understand that and when they commit themselves to curricular development, to opportunities in the school for all students to understand the histories that have brought us to this particular moment. You can't change outcomes without understanding how they've come about. So independent schools can take the lead on that to be responsive to their student populations and to the communities out of which the students come.
Okay, thank you all for bearing with me on my tech difficulties, but you all should be able to see the presentation again. Yes.
Thank you, Bailey, for showing that. Hopefully
Yeah.
that gave you all some context of what that looks like in education.
Yeah, so our next theoretical framework we wanted to give you some background knowledge on is culturally responsive pedagogy. And this comes from Gloria Ladson-Billings. And the general idea is to center students' intersectional backgrounds in teaching by taking into consideration diverse perspectives and experiences. Basically to work against this deficit perspective and beliefs about students, and then work to empower them in their expressions of knowledge and the experiences they have and how that impacts their education. This idea of community rather than individuality is really important, and one of the reasons we had us share positionalities with each other, because together we're a learning community, not just individuals who are here to listen and observe. Just like Maria and I didn't do this project independently, we worked together to invite each other into new spaces of learning, conversation, and opportunity for the outcome of higher engagement and advocacy, right? Because Maria and I worked together, we were able to challenge each other and show up for each other and engage with this content in very different ways. But in the classroom setting, we can look at student engagement as what and why are they interested in certain topics, what seems to motivate students on different levels, and then also learning advocacy for yourself, but also your peers and the communities you do exist within. Yeah.
So I'll hop in here and talk about the assessing the curriculum part. I mean, as I was making this slide, I was thinking about, teachers are very busy and I understand that. And so we don't always have time to reinvent the wheel, right? And so sometimes what that really means is assessing and really looking at curriculum, picking apart what serves our population and what wouldn't, right? Adding what we think might be better. So with that in mind, when you're assessing curriculum, again, as you're thinking about your own positionality, about the historical context of your students, etc., in the current context, right? Really seeking to empower rather than disempower your students. So really empower means that uplifting portion. Is there really space for students to express concerns and advocate, especially as we're thinking about people with disabilities as well? Thinking about that accessibility piece. What does that look like in their curriculum? Is there space for it? Is there a community-centered kind of community, as I mentioned, around learning and support for minority students, right? And so something that I think a lot about within assessing curriculum, but also teaching, is building that community. I think sometimes within realms of education, it can be very individualistic. And so really creating that strong sense of community, understanding, learning will really help empower students who may not feel comfortable expressing all parts of their identity. And also recognizing building community is not something that, again, that happens overnight. I'm sure many people can relate to this. It's going to take time and it's going to take effort. Again, also, refraining from any deficit views. That may be any outdated language, hurtful language that may be, oppressive. And of course, we're not going to know everything, but it's important to also listen to inputs of students, of people, and also just keeping up to date with language that could be hurtful, right? Or things or practices that could be hurtful. So vetting that curriculum with criticality is so important. Really ask yourself these questions. Who made the curriculum that you are trying to go and use in your classroom? What is their positionality? Now, this doesn't mean trying to define their positionality for them, right? I think that could be very harmful, but rather trying to figure out you know, what is their space in education? What is their background, from their point of view? From there, you're going to be able to really understand, did someone with a disability have a say in writing this, or did they not? Did people with people of color have a say in writing this? Are multilingual identities and perspectives represented? Those are things to think about. Something else is important, and a couple of vocabulary terms, is that hidden and null curriculum. And so the hidden curriculum, which could be found in teaching practices, but within curricula, is those unofficial expectations or implicit but hidden messages that constitute hidden curriculum, as defined here. And so these aren't really your, as I mentioned, your really overt, obvious forms of racism or ableism, but rather, what are the messages that are being sent in the way that you handle classroom management? Are you disciplining students of color more than you're disciplining white students? Are you disciplining students who have disabilities more than people who are able-bodied or who are not people with disabilities, right? Really thinking about those kinds of things. Language is power. Right, and so what you say really goes a long way, and it really affects not only the community and how other people perceive people with disabilities or people from different racial backgrounds, but also how they perceive themselves, right? And so while they may not tell you outward, hey, that really hurt, you know, over time, if they're hearing these deficit views or seeing these hidden messages within your teaching practices or curricula, they're internalizing that. And those are things that stick with them for years and years and years. So just really thinking about that. And it's not just a matter of also sticking, it's also a matter of their success within educational spaces as well. And then that null curriculum part is really just talking about what's left out. What do you not teach? What don't you talk about? So I think this quote really put it nicely, is we teach something by not teaching at all, right? That material. In exclusions of perspectives, we make clear cultural and political statements about what is of significance in society. So if you're not talking about, you know, different ethnic backgrounds, linguistic backgrounds, if you're not even talking about that within your curriculum, or your curriculum is not addressing that or accommodating those identities, right, you are making a louder statement than you think you're making by not saying anything at all. And then the last part here is really that context piece. So as I mentioned, right, it's getting to know your students, right? It's getting to build that community. Again, getting to know your students is not going to be something that happens overnight, as many people have probably already experienced, right? It's going to take time. And I think it's important to recognize that time. I think really understanding the context where you're teaching as well, within the community. I'm really understanding what is the historical background of the community, what does it look like currently, what's happening within the community that's not even just related to education, but other things as well. But then also branching out and thinking about not just your community, but also surrounding communities within the state, within the country, and globally as well. So really thinking about each of these pieces here as you're assessing that curriculum.
Yeah, cool. Thank you so much, Maria. Just before we move on, does anyone have any questions about that or comments they want to make? It's okay if not. I know we're just saying a lot of info. Okay, cool. So our next section that we're going to focus on are specific teaching practices and the implications that our teaching practices have on this broader idea of education for students with marginalized identities. And I've kind of broken this section up into 3 specific subcategories. We're going to start by going over like teaching methodology of why do we teach, and like what is our understanding of what learning means to people and to ourselves. And then we're going to focus on teaching before we're actually in the classroom, mainly with an emphasis on multilingual learner support. And then teaching while we're in the classroom, who are we as educators and what does that have to say and what impact does that have on students? So we have this idea about being like aware of who we are as instructors and engaging with our positionality. To actually transfer this over to inclusive instruction practices, we have to be cognizant that learning carries different weight for people in their lives. And so I'm asking you to be very brave right now and just send in the chat, what does learning mean to you? This idea of learning, maybe your experiences with it as an educator will impact how you define it, or maybe if you're primarily a student right now. I know that I have a pretty weird definition of learning because I'm a student and an instructor. So yeah, take a minute or two, and just type in the chat what learning might mean to you. There's no right answer. It's just your own ideas. You all are saying very great things. Thank you for participating. Awesome. You guys are giving us such great answers. And I hope as you're typing in your answers, you're reading through other people's as well. And I hope we're all observing that learning is just different for everyone based on the roles we play and the power we have within classrooms. And so Emma says it very eloquently at the beginning, and she says that it can mean so many different things. And then you all wrote your answers in that showcase that like learning is so varied for each person. It can be a way to gain knowledge and to develop from there, but it also can be a place to find community and learn from other people. And so if we look in just this group of 15 of us, learning doesn't mean the same thing to all of us, but we all decided to come to the same space tonight and explore how to grow as educators or as people involved in education. So thank you all for sharing that. I hope while I'm talking, when you get lost in the chamber of just my mono voice, that you can revisit each other's answers and realize that like learning is important for all of us for different reasons. And as teachers, that impacts how we carry ourselves within classrooms and learning environments. And so I'm gonna throw some big quotes at you in the next few slides, but as we walk through them, I hope you can come back to this idea that learning carries different weights in our lives. Sometimes it's an opportunity, sometimes it's a burden, and we don't have access to what that means for other people unless we ask and genuinely work to know. So one of the authors of DisCrit published an article in 2018 focusing on the ecology of classrooms through a DisCrit lens. And like much like how learning means different things to all of us, classrooms are experienced differently by every person in them. So I'm going to read this quote to you all. It says, "Multiply marginalized students of color in such spaces are often thought of as uneducable, and their classrooms simply holding spaces until they drop out or get arrested. DisCrit solidarity means rejecting exclusion as the easy answer and instead helping students recover from the assaults of an education system that repeatedly tells them that they are broken." And so when we look at this very heavy quote with a post-secondary lens, it's important to realize that students come to us in these spaces and in these learning environments with an entire lifetime of learning under their belt. There's internalized messaging that they've already been exposed to, harmful or maybe positive interactions from educators that impact the way they carry themselves in spaces and impact what learning means to them and how it is experienced by them. And I think oftentimes this is a really like common idea to throw out, like, oh yeah, learning is different for everyone. We all have different ideas and experiences. And when I've said this before, I feel like I'm met with this idea of like, yeah, I know this, so what? Like, okay, cool, I already know this. What do you want me to do about it? And my blanket response is that knowing the systematic barriers that are interwoven into the educational experiences of students with marginalized identities is one thing. And we can say we know this as much as we want, but we don't actually. But then directly interacting with our perpetuation of these barriers is another. And I use the term R because I recognize that my identity as a white person means that I exist in the racial majority in our country, but also within education. Educators are 90% white in the country of America, and that is not reflective of the population we work with. And so when I use inclusive language like our, I hope you know that I'm not removing myself from the perpetuation of harmful barriers or stereotypes that we implement on students, because you can't be removed from that. You just have to actively work against that every single day. But I wanted to give some examples of this, what perpetuation might look like for people who like to say that, oh, I don't do that at all. And that it can be something like not providing access to linguistically accessible learning materials before you walk into a classroom, not having translated materials, or not having opportunities or resources for students who may not have English as their primary language, not having resources for them. I know that I did this. This is my first year of teaching. And when I walked into a classroom the first few weeks in August, I was freeballing it. I was like, okay, we're just going to go in here with all the content I have and see what we can do. And then it took me a few weeks to realize I am doing such a disservice to these students by not just having resources and instructional materials in their primary language. Perpetuation of barriers can also look like isolating students with disabilities in certain spaces, maybe only providing opportunities for social growth and learning with other people with disabilities. That's not reflective of the larger world we live in. It can also look like viewing students' problems as someone else's responsibility. As an educator or people involved in education, we are committed to directly engaging with the humanity of other people, and that means like taking accountability for when you can and can't show up for people. But also, I think, and one of the most important ones, one of the most important, most prevalent barriers that are perpetuated by educators are the assumptions we make about students and their behaviors and their actions. And I feel like the example I always use is when teachers or educators or people in educational settings assume that students being on their phone is just because they're distracted or they don't care about what you're talking about, or they'd rather be any place than in the classroom. But in reality, you can be aware that they are human beings who have lives outside of your classroom. And I know this isn't always the case for everyone, and there are opportunities and students are on phones to be distracted. But discrit solidarity means that rejecting that the idea like students are just behaving badly because they're bad, especially when we look at students of color or students with disabilities and saying, oh, well, they're just easily distracted, instead of, no, they are human beings who have lives, and those are important. Another one is viewing students talking back as like disrespectful rather than a signifier that they may feel emotionally safe enough to challenge ideas in the classroom. When teachers give ideas or assignments and students' responses are like, oh, I don't want to do this. It's like, okay, well, why? What can make this better? We're learning together. We're learning through each other. And I'm listing a bunch of things off to you, but this is such a small list. And every single day we're perpetuating these barriers as educators, and we're not even aware of it. And so commitment to recognizing and working towards understanding our own teaching methodology as a tool to work against these barriers is really important. So Zaretta Hammond is the author of a book called Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain, and she focuses a lot on the way that we are programmed to process conflict or situations within classrooms that may elicit like knee-jerk reactions. And so I wanted to highlight these two quotes because I think it really touches on this idea of like, oh, I know this, so what? Because that idea limits us from being really self-reflective and hinders us as educators from growing. Zaretta Hammond states that being responsive to diverse students' needs as teachers to be mindful and present, that requires reflection. Engaging in reflection helps culturally responsive teachers recognize the beliefs, behaviors, and practices that get in the way of their ability to respond constructively and positively to students. Maria was saying how language is power, and every single opportunity we have to engage with students is a reflection of the way we use the power we have as educators. And so responding in a constructive manner and positively to students while acknowledging their humanity is vital to facilitating classroom relationships and environments and ecologies that are supportive of student learning. And then if you walk away from this presentation, the one thing I genuinely want you to take with you is this quote right here. And it says, the true power of culturally responsive teaching comes from being comfortable in your own skin, because you are not a neutral party in the process of education, of learning, of teaching, of facilitating needs, of working with coworkers. And our teaching methodology, or the way we view teaching and learning, is directly related to the role we play within classrooms. And then we allow ourselves as educators to recognize our limitations, not as failures, but maybe as areas that are in need of support. We have the opportunity to serve our students way better, way more holistically. An active reflection can look like, after like a challenging day of classroom work or after a really hard lesson, you sit down and you just write about everything that you experienced or happened within this classroom, what you remember, what things were said. You just put it on paper and get it out of your system. And then a day or two later, come back to a passage you wrote and identify themes or commonalities throughout your passage. Maybe this one phrase a student said really made you react in a way that you're not necessarily proud of. But identify like what sticks out to you, what is noticeable from these passages that you write. And I know this can sometimes sound like I'm just like, oh, write in your diary, like you're going to be a better teacher if you journal. But in all reality, you will be if you commit yourself to working with these passages, working with these reflective opportunities as a way to grow as an educator, not as a way to like talk bad about a student or talk or write about students in a way that's not identifying them as people with say in the classroom environment. But these are opportunities for you to identify your shortcomings and limitations as an educator. So yeah, do you have any questions about that? Okay, I'm seeing things in the chat and I want to make sure I'm not missing anything. Okay, cool. And so when we look at teaching methodology and these ideas of like, oh, you need to be like culturally responsive, you like need to be aware of everything happening with all your students, you need to know everything happening for everyone and include everyone's perspective on anything. Teachers often are like, well, I'm just a teacher, I like can't do all that. And the reality is that culturally responsive pedagogy or teaching doesn't ask you to reinvent the wheel or redo anything. It wants you to be, it challenges you to commit yourself to working on understanding the limitations and strengths of your own cultural identity. And that's all that is being asked of you. Culturally responsive means that you're aware of who you are as a person and what strengths you have, but also what knowledge you are lacking. And that is the reality of what culturally responsive pedagogy means within classroom environments. And so I wanted to highlight Mia, one of the first year of our students who participated in an interview. We asked her, when have you felt that your cultural identity has been valued and respected in school? And you can read through this. I don't want to put too much of my voice behind Mia's words, so I'm going to give you like 10 seconds to read through what she said. And in this quote, Mia's noting that she feels most supported or empowered or valued and respected in her cultural identity when she is in a classroom where the professor, instructor, or teacher is also Asian. And when I first heard her say this, I didn't think, oh, well, great, can't do anything about that. It's no, okay, great. That's good to know that that makes you feel seen and valued. What can I do now as your educator to highlight voices of people who are Asian or people you may feel more seen by as the person in power in the classroom? This isn't okay, well, can't do anything, bye, done, sorry. It's okay, cool. Where can I grow from here? Can I actually collaborate with Mia more and see what voices she would like to hear in our classroom to better reflect her own cultural identity and make sure she feels respected and valued, because that is the point of teaching students. So moving on to before we're in the classroom, I really like coming back to this idea of what we teach and why we teach it. And this means that teachers have to acknowledge their lacking of knowledge, but also that students in their classroom, especially students with marginalized identities, understand the world in a way that as a privileged person, you cannot. You can't just work to understand it. You can't do all the readings to understand it. You have to actively engage with what the student's knowledge is within the classroom. And a really good framework for approaching this is this idea of making the familiar strange. When I was 19, I first came across this idea and it sounded like really fun and easygoing. But as I've grown in my education, I've realized that this is a really hard process and not easy. But it can be embedded into active reflection, such as writing or conversations with other peers or coworkers. And making the familiar strange is defined as a critical first step for teachers to understand how their own cultural values shape their expectations in the classroom. And I wanted to give an expectation. This is not one that I hold, but it's one that I come across really commonly. It's this idea of turning work in right on time, or it's like not worth anything. And so coming into writing my syllabus for the course that I teach right now, I knew that I wanted to have a framework or idea that assignments can be turned in whatever, because the point of assignments is to reflect learning, not time management. That's a skill that can be worked on separately in education. And so I took this idea of like, well, why? Because I'm trying to justify the state of like, why do I let students turn in assignments late, or what is the backing behind that? And it's like the idea that people may hold this idea of turning work in on time is super important because it reflects time management, professionality, and commitment to learning. But if we also look at the same idea of a student could be not turning assignments in on time because they really do care about the content and want to make sure the work they're showing and showing up with is reflective of what they have learned. And that can be a challenging thing. And that just may not be a perspective that I had thought about before. And so that's one really easy practice of making this idea of like making the familiar strange and embedding it into your daily practice. For the sake of time, I'm going to move on because I appreciate you all sitting and listening to me talk. But teaching before the classroom is directly linked to inclusive multilanguage learner education, especially with the framework of culturally responsive pedagogy. The study that is cited right here was talking about and focused on how emergent bilingual youth students have the opportunity to showcase their learning on more levels and in more ways when they have the opportunity to use their primary language and English within the classroom. I'll let you read through this as I talk, but I found this study to be really important because the idea in post-secondary education that students have to submit everything in English is really prevalent. A few months ago was the first time that I engaged with a professor who said, you know what, turn your assignment in whatever language you feel most comfortable or that will most accurately reflect your learning or ideas. And I actually ended up adopting the same practice because if not, I'm actually doing a disservice to my students who may not be as proficient in English because I'm limiting the language and the scope of resources they have to convey their ideas and learning. And it takes me 5 seconds to use a translator. And translators can be anywhere from Google Translate if you have people within your staff or learning network that have the ability and time, and it is part of their job description to translate material. That is always a resource. But you can even use AI. That's become a really helpful resource for me this year. It's more accurate than Google Translate and provides you opportunity to change the reading levels, and so that you know you're actually pulling out the message that students are trying to convey as you go through the translation process. So that's a really helpful practice that you can embed. But teaching before the classroom is important because when I walk in to teach a lesson and I'm assigning a huge script of bullet points of what is required in this assignment and I give it to students in English, that can be 10 times more overwhelming for students who may not be as proficient in the English language. And so it takes me 5 minutes before class to sit down and translate those. Another quote from a student that I wanted to highlight is from Des. He's a first-year ROAR student. And during his interview, he kept coming back to this topic of how he feels empowered by speaking his native tongue. And so Maria and I continued to ask him as he explained a moment within his education where a teacher and one of his cousins got up on stage and spoke in their native tongue. And he was just beaming while he said this. And so we asked, like, when you saw your teacher and your cousin speaking their native tongue, did that make you feel proud? And instead of just saying yes, he took it a step further and said, they're showing that they love to be Native American and show what language they speak. There's an amount of pride in the language we speak. And as someone who has only spoken English, which is the dominant language in the United States and in education systems, I don't understand this perspective. And so when he said this, I said, okay, well, I really got to work with that idea. Like, I recognize that there's power in language, but there's also pride in language, and giving students the opportunity to showcase the multifacetedness of their linguistic power is a way to include them more deeply in the educational ecology or environment that you have. So kind of blown through this, everyone, sorry, but don't want to keep you here too long. Ramirez from the previous study states that older emergent bilingual students need to be exposed to cultural community resources that strengthen their identity and validate their community. And so as a white person who speaks only English, I recognize that I will never be able to be the person who is reflecting that aspect of students' identity, but I can work to connect them and provide them opportunity to engage with resources on campus or within schools that may better support that aspect of their identity. So I want to give the floor to Maria for a second so you all can get a break from my voice, but so she can highlight some of the campus resources for ITSE programs specifically at WSU for students who are either multilingual learners, bilingual, or yeah, go ahead. Sorry, I'll stop talking.
No worries. Thank you, Bailey. And so this part of community is really important. And I know there's some people who are not within higher education. So please apply this within your communities. It doesn't just have to be within school settings. And so within WSU, right, working with the Office of Multicultural Student Services, there are abundant resources up here on the fourth floor of the Cub that represent many parts of these students' identities. And there's the Disabled Student Center students can access, but also different multicultural centers. So such as Chicanx and Latinx centers, the AAPI Center, etc. The Native Student Center, LGBTQ plus center. These are all resources that students can access, right? And so what's important too is these centers, you know, they host their events and there's many student organizations that students can access. But what I found myself doing while at ROAR and even while I'm still connecting with ROAR students who come and visit sometimes is sharing some of these resources with them, introducing them to some of these supervisors who run these centers. Just that little introduction goes really a long way. And recognizing that simply just being in this space and seeing people who are like you or who speak a language just like you, who have same identities as you, is something that can be very liberating for students as they're navigating a predominantly white institution, right? And so it provides a space of safety. And so utilizing those community resources within the university has been really good and helpful for students, especially as I continue conversations with them outside of ROAR and within my role here at MSS. And so I know I talk about just the community in general here in higher education, but in K through 12 context, that could simply mean outside of your school community and within the actual local community. It's getting connected with different organizations and community. And again, recognizing that those connections are going to take time, right? And recognizing your positionality in your space in those communities as well is really important. And it's not just within locals, but it's also statewide and also nationally as well.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Maria. I think it's important to also be self-reflective at this time and just while I'm talking, think about other connections within your communities or your micro communities, which you could work to connect students with, or people you work with, or whatever you do for work, because I know we have a wide variety of people here. But there are resources within our communities for the gaps that we recognize we cannot fill for the people we work with, connect with, or engage with. And I want to point out that connecting students with resources is really important and vital, but it also plays a role in your classroom community or your educational community. You can't just connect students and think, okay, cool, we're done, we did our job, that's awesome, whoop-de-doo. It's recognizing that the connection students have play a really important role in how they perceive their community and how they engage with the community. And then that even moves into this idea of collaboration within the classroom. The resources and what students learn within their other communities or through their lived experiences matter with how we collaborate with them in the classroom. It's not saying, oh, cool, I'm glad you're involved in this community and you made this connection. We don't need to talk about that in class, but it's recognizing like, cool, what did you learn from this community organization or this connection you made or this advisor you might have or mentor? How can we actually take that and apply it to the learning you're doing now? Like, tell me about what you're doing so I can work with you to create materials or opportunities for you to more accurately demonstrate your knowledge. And so now as we move into teaching in the classroom, we're getting back to this idea of self-reflection and how we can grow as educators. And the idea of humility really kept coming back to me in almost every single reading I did. And so I pulled these two quotes that say transformative teacher resistance within DisCrit resistance must be rooted in humility. The second part of this last quote says, that is, teachers must explicitly refuse to believe that students of color act out more, are less capable of acquiring knowledge, or are more responsible for their behavior than other students. And just to put some of my own words to it, it's this idea that discrit resistance or pushing against ideas or this essentialist perspective that students with disabilities, students of color, multilingual learners have these barriers to them. we have to resist those ideas, and that resistance has to be interwoven into every single step of the educational process. It has to rewire how we view our teaching methodology, it has to rewire how we approach teacher prep work or teacher prep courses even, but then also impact how we reflect and behave within the classroom. And so the idea of humility is really important. So I wanted to leave you all with these practices. One is engaging in self-reflection, like I said, but also checking your implicit biases. And that means engaging with challenging conversations, like coming to talks like this or watching TED Talks from the authors of these books, reading books that may make you feel uncomfortable and recognize your shortcomings as an educator. But that also means not going to people who also share these marginalized identities or part of marginalized populations, and expecting them to be the ones to teach you. I'm not going to go to a teacher and be like, hey, was this racist, what I said? I need to really sit there and reflect and realize, why did I say this? Why am I having this question? And where can I go from here? It's on you to check your own biases, and through resources that are widely accessible. Google is free. Don't put that burden on other people who already live with the weight of the world on their shoulders due to the marginalization that they already experience. And then holding an inquiry stance regarding the impact of interactions on students. The relationships we have with students is really important to me. And so being humble about my impact and what I leave students with is pretty vital to the way I view my teaching methodology. I want to be someone in students' experiences that makes them feel more secure in their right to exist within educational spaces, but also so they know they're valued in every single way, shape, or form. And so that comes from me questioning like the motives, like more of who students are. I want to know who they are as human beings rather than what assignments they are turning in. And that's one way I've built humility, recognizing that the humanness and humanity behind who my students are is what drives them to show up every day, and that should drive me to show up for them every day. Okay. And I want to leave you with this quote. I'm going to skip through my last slide so we have some time for questions. But we asked every single one of our students what they'd like to see from ROAR classes, because we knew that's where we had the most say and impact. And Kevin states that he wanted ROAR staff and instructors to be more mindful of how students with disabilities can develop and interact with the ROAR community and the other communities they're involved in. It's not just singular communities they're involved in giving students space and opportunity to showcase what they learn and who they are in different communities is really important. So yes. Maria, would you like to close out with any words? I'm gonna jump down to our implications and considerations.
Yes, I will jump in here and just kind of really breeze through some of these. But really just some things, right? There's always going to be limitations or things to think about as you may be implementing some of these in your educational spaces or wherever you are. And so within this, webinar, we really talked about the teaching and the curriculum part of what it is to be teaching an inclusive post-secondary education program. However, we want to recognize there are greater systemic barriers that IPSE programs face and students with disabilities face that go beyond the scope of what we talked about today. So it's really important to think about that and thinking about advocacy and also including and empowering students to advocate for those, for the removal of those systemic barriers. Thinking about our own identities in connection to this work as people without disabilities, right? Both Bailey and I had mentioned that we are people who do not have IDD, right? And so thinking about how our lenses or how your own lenses really could affect some of the teaching practices and curriculum. Again, thinking about program location and context, right? We're located in a rural town, in a university or a college town. That context may not be the same for you, it may be similar, it may be different. There may be access to different resources and such. Every interaction with students is an opportunity to learn about this work. And so we really want to highlight that piece of, right, as we're thinking about breaking down barriers, it means including the students as well. We're not simply just doing these interviews once, just to do these interviews. These are continual, lasting conversations we have with students throughout the process. The context in which you engage with students is the driving force of how this information can be implemented in your work. So really understanding the place and space that you're inhabiting, again, your positionality in that piece. And Bailey, I think you can wrap it up with this last piece here.
Yeah, so the last thing we wanted to close out with is advocacy and even learning and engagement without self-awareness and criticality will never be in the student's best interest, or anyone's interest that you're working with or engaging with. If Maria and I just walked through these interviews and said, okay, cool, we learned everything we needed to learn, that's not doing anyone any good. But as we walked through these, we really wanted to hold the mindset of we have a lot to learn, even as we do these. Days after the interviews that we conducted, we were sitting there like, dang, I wish I would have done this. I wish I would have done this. I wish we could have asked this question. I wish we wouldn't have asked this question even. And we're very critical of ourselves because that's where we recognize the most growth can happen. And that was our process of self-reflection. So I just want to say thank you all again for being here. I know we did a lot of the talking, and so I want to open the last 15 minutes of this to you all so that you can ask us questions, maybe share your own ideas, perspectives. Maybe you were thinking about something this whole time. Maybe you disagree with something we said, and we'd love to hear it. So I'm going to stop my share. But yeah.
Thank you so much. I mean, I have 5 pages of notes, and there's a lot of information that's super applicable to my particular field. So for those who don't know me, my main role at WSU is as a professor of multilingual education, and having some other folks in here that are language focused, Angel and Dee. A lot of this resonates with you too, I imagine. And something that stood out to me was how you encourage to use the student's language and not be afraid that you don't know exactly what it means. It can be symbolic and content based, right? And a lot of teachers will be hesitant to do that because they might not be an expert in what that said, or even to let students respond in the language in which they're more comfortable speaking, or that kind of stuff. And I also appreciated the use of, instead of needing to be an expert on your students' cultures, you first need to look inward. And then the diversity and equity in classrooms course that I teach, we spend a lot of time looking at ethnocentrism and bias, and that making the familiar strange. I put an article in there from the original article in the Nasarima, which is American, right? So how to make body rituals seem exotic when in reality it's the stuff that a lot of us do every day. But Dee, I'm interested in how you're seeing this stuff in a K-12 setting, especially considering our roles within multilingual education and the overlap with special education was not to misidentify. And for so long it was, we got to make sure we don't misidentify, versus now there's that shift to, hey, special education and multilingual education, they go hand in hand, and it can benefit students with different abilities. And so did any of the topics discussed tonight resonate with things that you're seeing, PD or programming that's going on in K-12?
So much of it. The history through education in my 15 years of being in multilingual education has been like, it used to be that when students identified for special education services or on an IEP, they were immediately dropped out of multilingual education. So once they received that IEP like designation, they lost a significant portion of their ability to have access to their instruction or even practice their bilingual skills. So like, we've come a long way, but there's still so much to go. And there's so many students who end up being identified in special education that are multilingual that don't need to be there because of that deficit mindset, and teachers seeing that or having that like fixed thinking that they can't learn or they can't articulate their learning, or there's just so many barriers and fixed mindsets that still need to be like exercised and built up on. One of the things that really struck out to me this evening, Bailey, was when you were talking about like teaching before the classroom, especially with the curricular resources that we have to use in education, and they're like not always being vetted for inclusive practices. Is one of the things that I did with teachers a few years ago was, before they even like, as new teachers into a district, before even giving them the moment to like look at the curriculum, I had them sit down and look at their class roster. I'm like, look at your class roster, get to know your students before you get to know your curriculum or dive into the curriculum, because that's going to be the place that starts building our teachers like ability to exercise knowing their students first, rather than like getting hung up on teaching the curriculum. And that for me has been powerful. And I've had teachers come back and tell me that how powerful that was to have that first student first mindset before the curriculum mindset. So I'm going to quit using up everybody's airtime. This has been
No,
fabulous.
Me
yeah,
too.
thank you
We
for
could talk about
sharing.
this all night.
Yeah, thank you for
Yeah.
sharing. I appreciate what both of you said. Anyone else can take the floor if they want. If you have questions, if you want to put Maria and me in the hot seat, we're here for it.
I'll ask a question. To be fair, I missed most of the presentation because I had another meeting, which I'm really bummed about. So I'll go back and watch the rest of the recording. But Bailey and Maria, I've obviously worked with you all a pretty significant amount. But as we think about like culturally responsive practices and pedagogies, right? Bailey, I know that you embed so much of this into your course, right? And specifically, Maria, as you have done digital literacy when you were with us at ROAR, Bailey, as you've done it in career planning and professional development, and actually really all of you that are practitioners, I'm curious as to how you all have embedded, especially those cultural sharing, right? We've heard from Des about kind of sharing those pieces of his culture that are important to him, right? Without like tokenizing it in the classroom. How you all have allowed students to bring those pieces and share those with others that are important to them. How you all have embedded those into your teaching practices. Did you all touch on that before I got here? Did I miss that? I'm curious as to how that has been integrated at all. I know Anya and I have talked about this a little bit at conferences and strategies to do it, but I'm curious to hear directly from you all how that's been.
Yeah, we hadn't previously talked about specific practices or things we've done within our own teaching. But I know for me, the topic and course I teach is sometimes tricky when I think about this idea, but in reality, it's not really, because the work we do is so intertwined with our identity. And so even engaging in conversations with students of, well, how do you feel seen in your workplace? What aspects of who you are feel seen in the workplace? What feels important to share about yourself in the workplace? What's appropriate to share about yourself in the workplace? And although that's just another conversation to have, I think by starting to have those conversations, we open the pathway for more like active reflection through writing, through assignments, through conversations with coworkers to touch on aspects of our identity that may be important. And Maria, you can share too, or anyone else if you would like.
Absolutely, yeah. So Jenny, you talked on the tokenization part, right? What I refrain from in my teaching in general is to put someone in the hot seat who is not comfortable sharing that, right? And so it's, again, as Bailey mentioned, it's really opening that conversation and letting the student come to you, but also telling the student, you know, when I was working at ROAR and still currently as here at MSS, when I talk to ROAR students is, hey, there is a space here. If you want to go ahead and express your identity or explore that more, there's a space where you can just do that by simply just showing up in these spaces, right? And that may even bring conversations naturally in that way. And so one of our students comes up here frequently, and we have really, you know, critical conversations about some of the topics that affect the AAPI students in general. And so some of those may not happen within the classroom, but I think it's just kind of signaling that this is a safe space and here are other resources to explore that identity further, can really be a good bridge and gateway into having these conversations with students that could be critical or just generally, you know, hey, I noticed this and I saw someone that looked like me today and I thought that was great.
Yeah.
Additionally too, it's really thinking about not just the surface level representations of culture, but also some of those embedded ideologies within education. And I think education has a history of perpetuating individualistic identity or individualistic ideas. And so really thinking about how do we build community within the classroom, right? And that in itself could, you know, represent, you know, a space for students where they feel seen, like, hey, this is something that I do at home, or this is something that I've seen done here within my identity and within my culture. And I really appreciate that being uplifted.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting too is us being situated within a higher education setting too is we can share both those campus resources and like those personal pieces of our identity, right? That might not be things that we could do in other educational settings, right? Like Maria, you are now situated at a space where you can share those campus resources and now you can have like you have now the bandwidth to do that and say, hey, let's go walk over there, or we can do that with students, which I think is a really exciting a really exciting part about the work that we can do here at WSU. But I'm going to mute myself now.
Marcus, I see you're unmuted. Did you have a question?
I enjoyed listening. But yeah, I'll keep listening.
I was going to save my questions for our admin meeting tomorrow, but I might just ask if there are any particular challenges, Maria and Bailey, that either of you have found as barriers to implementing these strategies in your classrooms, in our space specifically.
Like, in all honesty, I'd say my own knowledge is probably the largest barrier. This is my first year of actual teaching. I feel like I'm learning something new every single day. So I'd say my own knowledge. And while Maria's answering, I'm actually going to drop a one-pager summation of what we talked about today with some linked resources for you all, if you are at all interested. So Maria, go ahead and answer. But
no, I think that's really something similar that I experienced at ROAR as well. And I think also just thinking about the course that I taught, digital literacy, I think the curriculum that we adopted, right? And I was critically looking at it and just the history of digital literacy as well as, not everyone here has had access to this in a way that they can fully access and understand some of these concepts, right? And so just thinking about that in itself, right? Has digital literacy always been accessible for people of color or people with disabilities or multilingual backgrounds? No, right? And so there was a lot of contextual things of like knowing certain language to represent a computer monitor or what have you, right? Those are some things that I noticed were kind of challenges. And really, in my 2.5 years there, I barely scratched the surface with being able to kind of incorporate some newer perspectives and some new pieces that would connect more with students from these backgrounds.
Thanks.
I know we have like 3 minutes left, and I don't want to keep anyone, and I have to run to class actually. But I just want to thank you all again for being here. Just seeing your faces and your names on the screens really is important. And so I'm happy you all were able to make it. And thanks to the Void for everyone who had to leave early. So yeah.
And I second that. Thank you so much for showing up and engaging in this awesome topic and supporting us. And like I said, we'll keep forwarding the next one and hopefully we can just make this like a regular conversation, right? But so with that, we are running out of time. Bailey and Maria, if you want to hang out for a second, we can wrap some other things up. But thank you everybody for showing up. This was fantastic.